Hey all, and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani. And since we did an entire episode on Cary Stayner, I thought we should do this little bonus on Kenneth Parnell, who is the man who abducted Cary's brother. So let's just jump right into it, shall we? Kenneth Eugene Parnell was born on September 26, 1931, to parents Cecile and Mary Olive Parnell in Amarillo, Texas. Cecile essentially abandoned the family when Kenneth was approximately 6 years old, and in order to make ends meet, Mary Olive moved the family, which included two sisters, to Bakersfield, California, where Mary operated a boarding house in which the family also resided. According to the book Stephen Stayner would write later on, Kenneth reported to him that he had been molested at age 13 by one of the many boarders his mother took in. From an early age, Kenneth seemed to be in trouble with the law, finding his way to juvenile detention for car theft and arson. In 1949, Kenneth married Patsy Jo Dorton, who was 15 at the time. The two had their first child in 1951, a daughter. On March of the same year, Kenneth was arrested for the rape of a child and impersonating a police officer. Kenneth showed a deputy sheriff's badge that he had purchased from an Army-Navy surplus store to a young boy and managed to lure him in. For the rape, he was sentenced to 4 whole years, of course. At one point, Kenneth escaped from the state institution in Norwalk, California, but fortunately that didn't last long. According to Kenneth, he kidnapped and assaulted the boy because Patsy was pregnant, stating, quote, "had to find another outlet," end quote. Patsy divorced Kenneth in 1957, and according to him, he married later that year and had a second daughter. Kenneth was then convicted of armed robbery in Utah, at which point his second wife then filed for divorce. Kenneth also claimed to have married a third time in 1968, but this seems pretty unsubstantiated. While working in Yosemite, Kenneth met Irvin Edward Murphy, a coworker, and convinced him that he was an aspiring minister. Kenneth convinced Irvin that he needed a boy to, quote, raise him in a religious type deal, end quote. Then, on December 4th, 1972, Kenneth and Irvin drove around handing religious pamphlets to children when they happened by 7-year-old Stephen Stayner as he was walking home from school, where he was a second grader. Kay stated that she was supposed to pick up Steve, and again, Kay is Steve's mother, if you remember from the Cary episode. But she was delayed picking up parts for Delbert. Kenneth pulled over asking if his mother would be willing to donate to charity, and he lured the innocent Stephen in his car before taking off. As they drove, he pretended to stop and call Stephen's parents. But as they went back to the car, he told Stephen that they didn't want him anymore, and the trio continued to Yosemite Lodge. Kenneth worked there as a night auditor. A week after they got to the lodge, Kenneth told Stephen that his parents couldn't afford him anymore, and so they simply gave Kenneth custody of him. That his new name was going to be Dennis Gregory Parnell, making sure that he used that name only from then on. Additionally, Stephen was instructed to call him Dad, and Kenneth began sexually assaulting young Stephen from that night on. Meanwhile, Kay stated that after she missed Stephen at school, she went home. Stephen wasn't there yet, but because the neighborhood was full of children, and so her and Delbert weren't initially concerned. They assumed that Stephen was simply out playing. After a couple hours, however, and no Stephen, Kay decided to make some phone calls, and one of them was to the police, reporting Stephen missing. They printed flyers and started handing them out. They went to the news stations and radio stations to get Stephen's information out there. Kay stated they tried to get Stephen's name and photo out in the news, but within weeks, the story faded into the background. At first, Kenneth beat Stephen into submission. Then, as time went on, Kenneth would switch from beating to giving Stephen special treats. And within weeks of the abduction, Kenneth put Stephen in school under his new assumed name. At one point, Stephen attempted to run away while Kenneth was at work. He got out to the road, but was in a completely different area than he was used to, and he got scared, and so he turned around and went back to the house. To keep from being identified, the family, quote unquote, moved multiple times throughout the years. By the time he was 11, Kenneth was forcing Stephen to drink to loosen him up. He got him a dog that they named Queenie, and for a while lived with a woman, Barbara Mathis, who freely abused Stephen as well, though I can't find much information on her, just that she was allowed to abuse him. Stephen went to school in Camchi. Friends of his said that, quote unquote, Dennis was shy, but once he was out of his shell, he was kind, that he wouldn't let friends go into his house, and when they got to the end of the road, that's where he was simply dropped off. Some friends thought that Kenneth spoiled, again, Dennis, because he was allowed to smoke and drink. Others thought Kenneth was weird because he had 2 pairs of pants, holes in his socks, and really dirty fingernails. Neighbor Pat stated she never trusted Kenneth, telling her daughter that she was never to go to Kenneth's house alone. When Kenneth thought it was time, likely worried that Dennis was getting too close to his friends and teachers, they moved from Camchi to Point Arena, another secluded area much like Camchi. There they stayed in a one-room shack. Kenneth tried to get Stephen to help abduct a young boy. It seems like around this time, Stephen was starting to age out of Kenneth's preference. No. But Kenneth got angry when the boys got away or Stephen failed. Later in interviews, Stephen would say that he failed purposely so that nobody else would have to go through what was happening to him. As Stephen went to puberty, again, it seems like he was simply outgrowing the interest of Kenneth, and while Stephen failed in helping him, Kenneth decided it was time to do it alone. On February 14th, 1980, Kenneth abducted 5-year-old Timothy White from Ukiah, bringing him home to where Stephen was. On March 1st, 1980, when Kenneth was out at work, Stephen decided he couldn't let the boy suffer the way that he had, and so he picked up the boy and carried him, and the two hitchhiked all the way back 40 miles to Ukiah. The night they fled, it was raining and cold, and the two made it approximately a mile before a man stopped in his truck and ended up giving him a ride all the way to the police station. Just an aside, he got to keep his dog Queenie after all of this. At 3 a.m. the next day, police were knocking on the door of the Stayners. Kay answered, and police stated it was about their son. Cary was out camping, and so she originally assumed it was about him, but police quickly said, "This is about Stephen." That he was at the Ukiah police station, news quickly found out and reported on finding the missing Stephen and Timothy. Kay and Delbert stated they were nervous because they had to meet their son all over again. After 7 years, he was different, and they were going to have to change to become a family again. Kay stated, quote, "What more can you ask for? He came home," end quote. Hundreds of people lined the street for Stephen's homecoming. At trial, Kenneth was convicted of abducting both boys, and for Timothy, Kenneth was sentenced to 7 years, and for the kidnapping of Stephen, 7 months. This happened because the case actually occurred in another county, which of course declined to prosecute for the kidnapping and sexual assault of Stephen, which resulted in this lighter sentence. He was paroled after 5 years. In 1989, Stephen Stayner was killed in a hit-and-run motorcycle accident. Timothy White was one of the pallbearers. He left behind a daughter, Ashley, and son, Stephen Jr. In 2003, Kenneth was arrested in connection with a kidnapping, as he attempted to get his caretaker to buy a 4-year-old in Berkeley, California. In 2004, he went to trial and was found guilty and, in accordance with the 3 strikes law in California, was sentenced to the harshest sentence available, 25 years to life in prison. Prosecutor Tim Wellman stated, quote, "He has been a danger to children his entire life," end quote. 4 years later, in 2008, 76-year-old Kenneth Parnell was placed on hospice. He died on January 21st, 2008, at 9:10 p.m. of natural causes in the state prison hospital at Vacaville. And that is the end of Kenneth Parnell and kind of that side story of Stephen. And I know that it doesn't completely seem relevant because I was talking about Cary a while ago. He's the Yosemite National Park Killer. But this does also take place partially in Yosemite, and it has the family tie. So I figured that I would just kind of put that information out there. Now, to all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.